Okay, welcome everyone. I want to say hello to everyone. It's a very rainy holiday evening here in the Lower Mainland.
Maybe you'll net.
Come on, plug it in there. Plug it
Uh,
in. Yeah, of course it will.
Aha, I muted everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. I'll unmute Don when the time is right. Uh, Welcome again. Happy holidays to everyone to the final speaker series of 2024. It's very pleasing to me to wrap up the year. It's been a huge learning experience for me and the rest of Forest History Association, and I'm excited for tonight's talk. Tonight, I'm honored to welcome Don Pigott here to talk to us about the seed business and his many years of experience. Don's worked in a variety of positions during his 13 years in the Forest Research Department at MacMillan Bloedel, where his responsibilities included seed supply for their reforestation program, establishment of their seed orchards, and supervision of the operational tree improvement program. In 1982, he founded Yellow Point Propagation, a private silviculture company providing a wide variety of services including code and seed supply and processing, and tree improvement consulting for the forest industry in British Columbia, Alberta, the US, and Europe. For the past 16 years, Yellow Point has also been working on gene conservation projects with whitebark pine, a personal favorite tree of mine, limber pine, alpine larch, and numerous other species. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Don. Welcome. And if I can find your name here, I will give you the ability to speak again. Oh, I'll invite you to unmute.
Okay.
Wonderful. I turn it over to you.
Okay. Now we need to.
Yep, so you want to jump right into your pictures?
Yep.
Okay, so we're going to go here and go here.
Oh, you got it.
And we're going to go share.
I have some tech support here. Sandy McKellar is giving me a hand today. And yeah, thanks very much. I get rid of that? Or?
Yeah, you can minimize it. Yep,
Yep.
there you
go. Okay. Yeah, I thank you for that kind introduction. I have worked in the seed or seed-related business my entire career, and I'm going to share with you sort of three aspects. First is the seed business in British Columbia as a whole, when it was primarily export. Secondly, the seed in British Columbia. And finally, I just share some of the work that I was involved with that you might find interesting. So, okay, so the advance forward is.
Oh, just going to use the arrows on your keyboard.
Ah, that's easier. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, can you see that all? Hopefully, or
I'm going to say they can.
yeah. Anyway, the first company that collected and processed seed in British Columbia was actually the Dominion of Canada in 1922, and they were harvesting seed and processing it for Great Britain to supply seed for the lands that were denuded by both the First World War and then later in the Second World War. In this second company that started was a company called, it started in 1922 and it folded in 1933. But one of the employees or assistant manager, Charles McFadden, he took up the gauntlet and built a seed processing plant in Richmond, which he operated for many years until he sold it to a fellow called Roche, Gordon Roche. And the Gordon Roche operated for many years and collected seed primarily for the British market, albeit they sold to several other countries in Europe and actually New Zealand and Australia. The black dots are as you can see, the companies that existed from 1922 to 1965. The other ones of note are Percy Ruth, and I'm going to show you a slide of him in a minute, and then Lisberg and Manning. Manning was an American company. They had initially they had two plants, a rough processing plant in the Haida Gwaii, or the Queen Charlotte's, and they had one in Qualicum, and also one in, they took over Percy Ruth's facility. Percy Ruth started in 1927, and he was the first private seed dealer in Canada. Percy Ruth, 1927, his son still lives in Metchosin, and I talk to him regularly. His son followed a little bit in his footsteps. He was worked on Conan seed insects for Forestry Canada for most of his career. Percy was one of the regarded as a real gentleman in the industry. That's him over to the left there with the cigar. And the rest of the people are First Nations, the Alphonse family, who collected what was called bull pine at that time, or ponderosa. That's why they didn't mind stacking them up quite like that. I can't see that part myself.
I don't think you can.
Oops, you got to go back.
Yeah.
Here. Yeah. You can see, hopefully you can see the numbers of amount of seed that was produced in the early days. And even 1948, Gordon Roche shipped 2,000 pounds, over 900 kilos of Sitka spruce to Britain. Squirrels were actually introduced to Haida Gwaii, the Charlottes, in 1950 to facilitate cone collection. There was two purposes, actually. The other was to provide food for the American marten, because they were trying to stimulate not only a cone collection business, but also a fur trade. Like I said, 1950, but there were records of squirrels there before, probably by one of the seed companies. Squirrels had few predators. The populations were low of the pine marten or the marten, and within a few years, cones started to rain down, and they no longer had to cut down these enormous Sitka spruce and leave them lying all over the landscape. And the market, the Dominion of Canada, they needed a lot of seed for the restoration after the war, and even today, Great Britain plants about 35 million Sitka spruce a year. That's 70% of their plantations, and 50% of the commercial forest area. There's 40 to 50 year rotations, and the 2,500 per hectare. Sitka spruce was famous for not only the spruce goose of Howard Hughes, but also mosquito bombers during the Second World War. And where did the seed go? And you can see that seed from BC has gone just about throughout Western Europe and as far as Australia and New Zealand. I've seen fine plantations of ponderosa in Argentina and Patagonia, and also in Douglas fir as well, particularly in Argentina. Yeah, the volume, as I pointed out, was much greater going to Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and other countries than it was being used in BC. Here, natural regen was a standard practice until the 40s, until planting increased. First nursery was in Victoria on Shelburne Street in 1926, but the number of seedlings remained low until after World War II. Green Timbers was the first large-scale production nursery with a 6 million objective. From 1950 to 1962, the demand dropped to as low as about 3.2 million in 1956. But it rebounded in 76 up to 110, and for the last few years, it's been 275 to 300, 305. I think this year it's estimated it's going to go down to about 235. The first seed plant built by the province was in 1956 at Duncan, and Bruce Devitt, who's on the line, I believe, had a hand in that. It was fortunate there was built just before a bumper crop in 1959 and 1966. They had some drawbacks. Mainly, it was in a floodplain, and eventually it was moved to Vancouver in 1986. And the state-of-the-art facility of mixture of material equipment provided in BC, and also a Swedish company, BCC. Now, in the early 1950s, there was a Forest Service ranger named Frank Bernard in the Salmon Arm district, and he dabbled in seed, and eventually in 1966 he went out, built a seed plant, and started on his own. And it was a very wise decision, because in 1970 there was a bumper crop of Sitka spruce, and he secured a contract with the British government for 2,000 kilos of Sitka spruce seed. The fellow who worked at the Dominion of Canada's seed plant, Charles McFadden, when it closed in 1933, he decided to go into the business on his own, and he built the plant, I think, in 1936, which he sold later to Gordon Roche. Gordon Roche operated it up until about 1974, I believe, and then sold it to Reed Collins Nurseries. The plant moved actually from New Westminster to Richmond, and then Reed Collins moved it out to their nursery site at Aldergrove. I started processing seed in 1988. I had started a business on my own in 1982, and I was collecting seed for domestic and foreign markets. But at that time, I had a very good relationship with both Reed Collins and Western Tree Seed, Frank Bernard, and they were processing the seed for me. In 1987, the ministry auctioned off all their equipment, and I was working for the Swedish and Norwegian governments at the time, collecting seed throughout the Arctic, and my wife sent me a fax showing all this equipment for sale, and I bid on everything, and I got all the equipment that the Forest Service left in Duncan. And in 2006, they had a mobile seed extraction plant, and I put a bid in on that and was successful again. It's hard to explain to your wife when you want to bring home a 40-foot trailer to park in your yard with seed equipment. So in 1991, the federal government came to the four companies. So read from the left, my own company. The middle is Peter Hellenius of Silva Seed, or Silva Enterprises rather, Frank Bernard from Western Tree Seed, and Paulus Remo from Reed Collins. The government approached us to form an organization that they could deal with in the certification of tree seed for export abroad. Up until that time, everybody worked independently. Frank Bernard was really the champion to encourage the federal government to embrace this system of certification called OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And basically, it was just a quality assurance program to ensure that seed was being collected where it said it was, and in the volumes that people said it was. We discovered, despite we were competitors, we got along very well. And we did much more business together, and we even produced a publication which people still use today on collection of cones in BC. 2 years ago, the Vernon Seed Orchard Company decided that it was part of their business model was to build their own seed processing plant, and they asked me if I would give them a hand, and I was more than happy to. And it's worked out very well. It's a steep learning curve, but they're doing extremely well. Part of although a lot of the equipment I got came from the Forest Service, my father had to design some equipment based on a model that George Edwards at the Canadian Forest Service had made with an air separator of seed. And so I built a couple for Vernon Seed Orchard Company. So know a little bit now about the export business, but what about in BC? Well, initially everything was wild seed collections, and in 1959, I'm going to say, and Bruce is on the line, he can correct me. Dave Wallinger came down, and along with Bruce and Mike Marr, they were asked to establish seed production areas that could be thinned and managed by applying high rates of nitrogen fertilizer, usually 200 pounds per acre, to induce cone crops. The next stage after that would have been seed orchards, where the need was justified, and but still maintain seed stands and wild collections after that, and I'll get into that. So yeah, here's the three musketeers on the right, first Bruce Devitt, Dave Wallinger, and Mike Marr, and they went about looking for ideal stands in areas of mostly above 1,500 meters, I believe, to supply seed for those areas. And one of the first ones they established was on Mount Provost. This was a high elevation Douglas. It's the only picture I had of a seed production area, a high elevation seed production area on Mount Hall behind Ladysmith. Most of these stands were climbable. Trees were under 60 feet tall, and they were fairly widely spaced. Lots of sunlight to induce a cone crop. This is the Chilliwack seed orchard, seed production area, and that, if anyone knows, that's Wilk Roads, a little younger and a little thinner, and that was a small seed orchard established, seed production area established in 1958. The story behind that is when Charlie Johnson came into the region, he had somebody ribbon the trees that were supposed to be retained, and they thought a crew thought that was the ones to cut out, so they cut out all the wrong trees. If you ever stop at the Britton Creek rest stop for a samosa and a cup of coffee, if you walk into the forest or the bush behind there, that was an Engelmann spruce seed production area established, I believe, by Dave Wallinger sometime in the early 60s. So, a summary: the ministry established 30 orchards in coastal Douglas fir and interior Douglas fir, Engelmann spruce, M&B, who I worked with, and I spent a lot of time on the seed production areas, and have some good extensive files still. We put in 17 Douglas fir orchards, 3 hemlock, 1 lodgepole pine. I know other companies have established them, but I didn't have any information on that. These seed production areas had mixed success. The Mount Provost one was outstanding. The others were lackluster, probably at best. When the heavy crop in natural stands occurred in 1966, the pressure was off to manage the seed production areas. And then my boss, Kai Hermanson, and at the time at MacMillan Bloedel, and Dave Wallinger both coincidentally came to the conclusion that you're better off to have reserve stands or protected stands that could be logged at some point when there was a good cone crop, and it could either be clear felled or individual trees felled, and there's actually still 86 of those on the books. Now, Jerry, I hope I'm not going to offend you here. Really, the Alan O'Ring is called the father of forest genetics, and he wouldn't have been so if it hadn't been without the help of Jerry Birch, who was able to secure or convince people in the forest companies to support their programs, which were grossly underfunded and understaffed. So Jerry had Alan had written a publication on, given a talk on seed provenance and reforestation sort of pointing out the deficiencies in the registration system, how seed was deployed. There was only 3 seed zones in Vancouver Island at that time, and they were questionable, some of the parents that were collected from. And Jerry went to visit him at Cowichan Lake and with a bottle of rum, and they came up with the concept of the plus tree board and plus tree wheat. These plus tree weeks, I think there were 6 or 7 of them. There'd be a crew of folks go out and wander through the bush side by side and pick out outstanding individuals within different stands and argue about their attributes and finally select trees. And then the trees were selected for straight stems, minimal taper, fine branching, high specific gravity, and long fiber length. Scion was collected from these trees or small branches and taken back and grafted into seed orchards. And quite often seeds were either collected from crosses on those grafts, or even in many cases we went back and collected seed off the original parent. I wasn't involved in any of the Douglas fir plus tree weeks, but later on with the Western hemlock, we did a similar thing, and we usually selected independently, but would scrutinize them later. And I can remember sitting in a hotel with people from several companies one night, and we were all having either beer, whiskey, or rye, and cleaning our guns. And I thought to myself, well, this could be a recipe for disaster. So 1959 to 1970, the plus tree board, and it evolved into the tree improvement councils from 70 to 98. And in 1998 or 97, actually, the chief forester asked the members to come up with a plan, and the Forest Genetics Council was formed to coordinate genetics, forest genetics in BC. In 1998 as well, the Select Seed, wholly owned company by the Forest Genetics Council, was founded to increase seed orchard capacity, particularly in areas where companies or the Forest Service had not already ventured. The earliest seed orchard and clone banks were established between 59 and 65. And if you take a look at the list of places, they were all in the wetter side of the island as a rule, except for Nanaimo River and Nanaimo Lakes. And that was to try and avoid having pollen contamination around the orchards from the natural stands. Unfortunately, they did not flower well. And it basically, it didn't take long to realize that it boiled down to poor location. So I think Tassis Company in 1966 purchased land in the Saanich Peninsula, and that certainly was much better climate, more conducive to flower production, and crops certainly is far more productive than any of the previous orchards. In the interior, the Okanagan and Shuswap proved to be the most productive for the interior Douglas fir, western larch, interior spruce, and western white pine. And the orchards started being established in 1981. There was lodgepole pine orchards established at Red Rock and near Prince George previous to that, and the flowering of the lodgepole pine was quite good. However, the lodgepole pine orchards in the Okanagan failed to produce, they produced good cone crops, but not good seed crops. And after several years, the decision was made to establish new orchards near Quesnel, one by Vernon Seed Orchard Company and one by Select Seed just a few years ago. And the Vernon Seed Orchard Company's orchard is producing very well. And this shows the orchards locations in British Columbia. About half of them are private, and the other half are either government or select seed. Now, how did I get here? I started tree planting for a fellow by the name of John Revel in 16 Creek near Cowichan Lake in 1963. And John used it, I think, as a source of cheap labor, maybe not very good labor, but he would take us out on weekends planting trees. And he really inspired myself to go into forestry. That's the same stand that we planted in 2007, and my son logged it a few years after that. So I did go in. I went to Selkirk College to take forestry. Between my first and my second year, I got a job in Prince George, and I was the lowest person on the totem pole. And they decided I was going to look after cone collections in one of the ranger districts. And our instructor, who came up from Victoria to put on a course, was none other than Bruce Devitt. And that's 56 years ago now, and Bruce and I are good friends to this very day. I talk to him almost every week, and good to see him on the call. Yeah, unfortunately, they gave me a group of a baseball team, and or as I referred to them, juvenile delinquents. The other fellow who looked after cone collections in the other ranger district got inmates from the Prince George jail, and I think he got the better deal. They put us out in an abandoned, semi-abandoned logging camp, gave me a cook and a faller, both of whom turned out to be alcoholics, and things did not go well. And I remember Gingy Kanishi at the end of the season saying to me that it was the most expensive cone collection in the history of the Forest Service. Then, after I finished school, I went to work briefly for a Tassus company in engineering, but that was not where I had my eyes set. I was interested in silviculture. And fortunately, Dave Handley hired me to be on the research crew and work under Kai Hermanson. And these are the two of the guys who really inspired me to work on seed collection and tree improvement in particular. And it's I really do owe my career to them, along with some of these other mentors previously mentioned. One of the first things they said was prepare a site for cone banks and seed orchard. And we had available land near the Harmac pulp mill, and it was standing timber, and we had to try and turn straw into gold, basically. But it did work out, but it was an awful lot of work. And within a few years, after at that time, the companies did all their own propagation. And we had a steep learning curve to graft, and we grafted our own material. We got cone crops at quite an early age, not as prolific as at Saanich, but certainly satisfactory. And when we did get crops the first few years, most of the work, a lot of the cones or flowers, we did controlled breeding to help the ministry breeding program. This is what it looks like today, these clone banks, actually. And the orchards on the same site, we collected there even after the Weyerhaeuser absorbed MacMillan Bloedel, and the site had been sold to the regional district of Nanaimo. We made a deal with them. There was a shortage of seed, and we were able to go in there and collect seed in 2000 and 2001. And this is the breeding work that we did for Chris Heeman for the Douglas Fir breeding program. So in 1977, 78, Kai and Dave Handley were instrumental in getting me to be traded to Norway. We had worked with quite a few Norwegians on the thinning research, and they had told me about the advancements made in the tree breeding program in Norway. So they thought it would be a good idea for this exchange, which worked out very well. We traded houses, mortgage payments, wages, everything. It was a lot of fun. I learned a lot about seed orchards. The Norwegians, as opposed to some of the other countries, had extremely good seed production, in particularly the Norway spruce, but also in the Scots pine, as opposed to Sweden and Finland, who probably, again, it boiled down to location, location, location. This is an island called Eloy, where it's pure sand, and they actually the spruce produced too many cones. I also learned how to ski. When I said I traded wages, at that time, my wages dropped by 50%. And a bottle of Canadian Club was $8 at that time in Canada, and it was $36 in Norway. So my neighbors taught me how to make moonshine. So I have my papers in making moonshine now. So I returned to M&B Canada, and we finished establishing the 50 acres of clone banks and seed orchard at the Harmac, which is on the left. And I was asked to go looking for land to increase the area of our seed orchards. And just by good luck, we found a piece right beside the Crow and Gate pub, not too far away, suitable land. And we also were asked to establish a nursery, and we established the first forest company nursery in BC to produce 3 million trees a year. Now, coupled with the orchards, we were also collecting a lot of wild seed. And because we were a part owner in Flying Tankers, who owned the Martin Mars, we had really good access to helicopters. And one of the pilots, by the name of Bruce Payne, some of you will know, he came to me one day and said, "I've got this idea to harvest cones from Grand Fir. We'll put you in the bucket with a power saw, hang you under the helicopter, and fly you up to the top of a tree, and you can cut the top off the choker and bring it back to the thing." After the first time I came back, he came over and asked me what I thought of it, and I said, "Well, I was terrified, but I think I could probably get used to it." And I asked him if he had ever done it, and he said, "I may be a helicopter pilot, but I'm not that stupid." So when I was in Norway, I got to travel extensively through Scandinavia and down into Germany, and everyone told me that when I come back, I should go into the seed business and become a millionaire. So that I always had this ambition for something more challenging, and so I eventually the opportunity came in 1982 when the company was in financially troubled straits, and I was able to throw myself under the bus and start in business and given contracts to do work for them after I left. So we started doing seed supply planning for several of the companies. We would collect what they needed. I'd calculate out their planting requirements, or not their planting requirements, but their seed requirements based on their planting numbers. And we did tree improvement consulting for the Ministry of Forest and the companies, parent tree selection, provenance, collections for domestic and foreign clients, and orchard establishment, relocation, and whatever else was fun. We used to say that the other name for our company was AFAB Enterprise, which stood for anything for a buck. When they came to cone collecting, we didn't do this on the coast at all, but certainly in the northern interior and Yukon, the companies who were harvesting seed for export, particularly to Sweden, this was lodgepole pine, and they were almost entirely collected from squirrel caches. And these middens would be scattered throughout the forest, and people would go through with a bucket and pick these things up and be paid by the buyer. You know, in the interior of BC, the Douglas fir is also and there's a good squirrel population. It's easy to make some really good money in a day picking cones. A lot of the collections we made in the early days too were by climbing, and some from felled and bucked, but normally we avoided felled and bucked. We didn't mind pre-felling in stands and collecting rather than having to crawl over logs that were strewn across the landscape. Then in the late 76, 77, we started collecting cones by off the skid of the helicopter. Basically pull up beside the helicopter, cut the top off, pull the top into the thing. There was even a company in Williams Lake that made boots that fit in the helicopter to keep the pitch from getting all over the interior. And it worked okay, but it was very slow and costly. From there, some of the pilots took a look at that, and a couple of them came up with the idea that it was better to have a harvesting device under the helicopter. It had been tried previously by the federal government and Jack Walters at UBC Forest, actually, but it was a monstrous piece of equipment that you needed an extremely large helicopter to lift. But then a fellow by the name of Helmut Fandrich came up with the concept of a cone rake, and I'll show you here. And this is the first one of the first collections we made. It was 1988. We made one in 86 and 84 on the same site. And these folks here, including my son on the second from the left, all collected with us, and some of them even collect today. Now, basically, the concept is you have different kinds of apparatus that is lowered over the top of the tree. And this one is called a branch collector or a rake. And goes over the top of the tree, pulls up, the branches fall into a cage around the tree, taken to a landing where the crew separates the cones from the branches. And you can see this is about standard how much of the top of the tree you take. This is actually from Buckley Bay. We harvested that sand in 86, 88, and 2009. So from basically the same trees. And this is my former partner, Gerhard Kirky, and he is not killing his wife. He's removing the pitch from her shoes there. Grand fir, you get quite a pitch build up, and after you've been walking on the branches and cones for all day. This is collecting amabilis. This is Victoria Peak in the background. You can see the rake has just come down. It's got a mechanism, a manual thing. You release, and the cage separates, and the cones come out. And you have to pick the cones by hand from. And you can see there, this is interior Douglas fir at Spuzzum of all places, and you can see you get quite a load of cones. Usually we use a Hughes 500 or a Hiller Saloy or a long Ranger, because you need it for the weight. And it's very effective for yellow cedar. You can harvest cones by helicopter for 4 or 5 hours, and you've got enough for a crew of 30 people there for probably 2 or 3 days sometimes, because of the size of the cones. And sometimes things don't go as planned. You bring in a Christmas tree and you have to remove it from the rake. The second type is the aerial topper, and you can see there the pilot Tom Arduini in this particular case lowering it over a Lazio carpa, and cut usually about 6 to 8 feet off the top of the tree. We have probably barged cones out of every logging camp up the coast of British Columbia. This one happens to be the head of Pitt Lake, actually. Normally, we don't like to have cones transported like that for more than 3 or 4 hours, and because they are susceptible to heating, because it's like hay, they get hot when they're trying to release moisture. So how has seed collection changed? The increasing use of seed orchard seed. It's somewhere between 60 and 70% on average for all the species now. There are still markets or places where domestically people do collect seed. These are usually particularly low MAI areas or areas where the demand for seed is very low and it doesn't justify in putting in an expensive orchard. Climate-based seed transfer guidelines are very more complicated than they were when there was only 3 seed zones on the coast, for example. Diminishing expertise in seed collection, natural stand seed collection. It's not rocket science to learn how to collect cones by helicopter, but just the aftercare to get them to a facility where they can be stored and allowed to cure slowly and naturally is important. There are fewer natural stands to collect from in some areas. This particular, in one case, grand fir on Vancouver Island, on the east coast of the island here, because of urban development and low elevation harvesting, we have a tough time getting grand fir stands to harvest from now. Grand fir was very popular until I overcollected 1,000 kilos that one year. It's used on rich sites in Europe, and in Denmark it has the highest annual growth of any tree species there. The demand for seed globally has fluctuated wildly over the last 100 years, so it's made it difficult or problematic for people to invest in processing. There are only, other than myself, there's just Vernon Seed Orchard Company and the ministry right now. And the current capacity for processing is just able to meet the need. You can see there that the target was 75% by 2020, and it didn't make it in terms of the amount of improved seed available for reforestation in British Columbia. So some of the other things that I'm going to tell you about that I've been fortunate enough to be involved with. After my work in Norway, and I got to work with people as well in Finland, Sweden, Denmark, and Iceland. In 1987, I was asked to participate in an international collection called the Nordic Forest Research Cooperative, where we collected seed from all of the conifer species at high latitudes, basically above 55 degrees, and actually most of them are above 59. And we made over 920 collections throughout Northwest Territories, Yukon, and Alaska. I've also made research collections of aspen and grand fir for Germany and Poland. The aspen actually is used to grow for biomass in Poland. They actually wanted more pollen than anything because they were hybridizing the European aspen with the Populus deltoides, or the trembling aspens, right? And we've made range-wide alder collections for several organizations, Great Britain, and also Forestry Canada. We've established orchards for other people. This is a white pine orchard, a breeding orchard actually for the Ministry of Forest, established on the old fire base at Cobble Hill. And now there's another orchard, a production orchard, going in there as well. At one time, we had 5 orchards of our own, 2 Sitka spruce and 1 western red cedar, 1 grand fir, and 1 Douglas fir. The Sitka spruce on the upper left there has been the most productive one. That's for a spruce orchard for weevil resistance, and it's one of 2 in the province, and a highly productive orchard. We had another Sitka spruce orchard that was strictly for Great Britain. It was non-weevil resistant parents, and but there is no Sitka spruce weevil in Great Britain, so it wasn't a problem. Unfortunately, the EU changed the regulations for import, and because it was an untested on orchard in the UK or anywhere in Europe, they would not allow seed to be exported from it anymore. The lower left there was a grand fir orchard. It seemed like a good idea, and it probably would have been, given the fact that we don't have any grand fir stands anymore, but it boiled down to poor selection of site again, and it didn't produce a lot of cones. We affectionately referred to it as the money pit. And I see Patty Brown is on the ground. This is an orchard we got from her when they closed down the Canfor site. We planted this orchard in Yellow Point, and it's the majority of the parents in this orchard are American, and most of the seed needs in BC have been met by the existing orchards by the ministry and the forest company. But this orchard, we have a bit of a niche market in the US. We actually relocated, I think, 10 orchards, mostly for the ministry. This was one for what was called the Dutney orchard in the area in Submaritime, where they had put in clone banks out in Aldergrove and wanted to put an orchard in at the Surrey nursery site. And so we, my partner thought it would be a good idea. So we put a bid in on this, and we moved about 900 trees to this beautiful site. It was worked out very well, and they were very pleased. Unfortunately, several years later, the ministry sold the land, and it's now an industrial park. This is my former partner, Gerhard, and this is a Western White Pine Provenance trial that we established in '88 for Mike Marr when he was at Forestry Canada, and Mike Marr and Rich Hunt. And we're very proud of this place. It was, it's turned out very well, and there's a lot of good news in this plantation. You know, primarily that if you plant enough trees, you probably can get along with the rest. Some of the other things we have done is hybrid poplar propagation. When MacMillan Bloedel started a division called Poplar Farms and was renting land both in BC and in Washington State, where they were planting hybrid poplar, they wanted controlled crosses down of the black cottonwood and the eastern poplar, and so we would get pollen from eastern U.S. primarily, and cross it with selected parents from of black cottonwood from BC. Very interesting. You could get upscale them very quickly because they root extremely well. So these are in the lower right, they're rooted cuttings that have been planted out and would be further upscaled again, propagated for operational deployment. The biggest problem was that the market ended, the bottom fell out of the market, and also the hybrid seemed to be more susceptible to a particular rust. So the last part I'm going to talk about is gene conservation. For the last 16 years, I've been fortunate enough to been hired by the ministry and under the direction of the Forest Genetics Council Subcommittee of the Gene Conservation Technical Advisory Committee, and I have to go out into awful places like this to collect seed from species that are either at risk or poorly represented on the landscape. And there are some reserves for special places that cover some of these things. This is grand fir from the Buckley Bay area. We've been trying for 20 years to have this set aside. It's now part of the forest license of the Comox Band, and they seem willing to exchange it for another area. It's some of the biggest grand fir you'll ever see. the system of parks that we have maintains all these wild populations very well, but there are still gaps in protection. So the ex situ is primarily where we collect seed it goes into long-term storage at the Forest Service Tree Seed Center for insurance in the event of some ecological disasters. And that has happened. This is the picture in the lower left there is Bear Mountain, the largest, I call it the largest clear cut on Vancouver Island, and was once one of the nicest Gary Oak meadows that you could ever find. The fire in the background is the fire from last year, the Salmon Arm fire, and that was a fantastic population of Western yew, and it just annihilated it. So. And these are basically, this is the matrix that I work off of, and these are the Beck zones which the species for conservation are present. There's a couple there that might surprise you, and I think there's an error there. Yep, nope. The Grand Fir is, again, because of urban development, is at risk on the island here. The Laziocarpa, there are some very unique populations, but they're being heavily impacted by balsam woolly aphid. And so since 2008, I've collected seed from 27 species, 3851 individual trees, 272 populations over 12 biogeoclimatic subzones. The number one species of concern, of course, is whitebark pine. It's the only red listed tree in Canada, and it's has a mutualistic relationship with the bird there, the Clark's nutcracker in the upper left, and it's surprisingly a important foodstuff for grizzly bears. This is on the potato range in the Chilcotin. We have an association or a group called the Whitebark Ecosystem Foundation of Canada. It's a volunteer organization. We have paid salaried or people that we do all kinds of restoration activities, and we go out cage cones because the birds will eat them if we don't. We collect seed. Some of the seed goes for operational deployment. Other goes for screening for white pine blister rust because it is a 5-needle pine. And is in the last 2 years, we've established 2 orchards. We have a memorandum of understanding with the Ministry of Forest, and they basically look after the breeding, and we look after seed orchards. And limber pine, if you go online and search out the loneliest pine, you'll find a brochure my partner and I put out about limber pine. It's limited to the southeast part of British Columbia, a lot more common in Alberta. But as a rough estimate, we've said probably less than 10,000 trees in BC. And they grow in these awful places. They're really only concern is the white pine blister rust, again, because it is a 5-needle pine. A couple others I'm going to tell you about. Cascara, some of you may have been strippers or not, but in anywhere from 1920 on, people were paid by the pound for cascara bark because of its laxative properties. And they would strip the bark off, dry it, sell it to buyers. And there was literally hundreds of tons of bark went to England for processing. And this picture in the lower right, there's tablets that I saw in the New Westminster Museum, actually. And I saw some also on Main Island as well. So fortunately, there's been all kinds of synthetics developed. But it was in the Cowichan Valley hugely impacted by people particularly during the Depression, who did anything they could to make money, and all of the bigger trees were decimated, really. And then the last one is Western yew, and this is 1991. The chief forester was excited about fact that the last yew tree in British Columbia was going to be killed because it was stripped for its bark for Taxol for cancer, primarily ovarian cancer. And so Alvin Yanchuk, the geneticist from the Ministry of Forests, and we got together and we went around and sampled populations throughout British Columbia for levels of Taxol to see if there was any genetic differences or provenance effect of amounts of Taxol. There actually wasn't. There was more variation within stands than between stands quite often, which is not unusual. And we also took the samples we took went to the National Cancer Institute and to UBC for testing. We also collected sign material and seeds, and they went into a clone bank at the Missachi Lake Research Center. Anyway, yeah, I've had just an amazing career and had all kinds of challenges and most interesting work throughout my life. I've had sort of tremendous mentors, like I mentioned, like Bruce Devitt and Mike Marr, and Kai Hermanson, and Dave Hanley, and didn't know Jerry that well, but certainly feasted on his knowledge. And I'd like to thank all of those folks and my very patient family as well. Thank you.